Axiom Verge is a Metroidvania created by sole developer Thomas Happ and released in 2015. It released to critical and commercial success, which Happ found difficult to take much joy in as he was struck by a couple of personal tragedies shortly after the game came out. I won't go into them here, but there is a 25-minute documentary on IGN's YouTube channel which I will link to and would recommend watching. 9 years on, I do hope things are better for him and his family, but I have tried not to allow this to influence the review. The game begins simply enough with our protagonist, a scientist called Trace, conducting an experiment that goes wrong, and when he wakes up he is on a hostile alien world. A large but weakened machine asks for his help to stop her dying before falling unconscious. There's two things that strike one immediately about the game. The first is its visual style. I've never played the old Metroid games, but it's safe to say that Axiom Verge is paying homage in more ways than one. Happ's artistic skills are on full display, and the quality of the pixel art is clearly exceptional. Everything is crisp, colourful, and much of it helps make the world feel alive. I particularly liked some of the animations, small touches like the way Trace's coat will billow behind him as he runs and jumps. However, I can't deny that while the artwork on a technical level is excellent, I did find a lot of it, the environment and common enemies, to be rather uninteresting. Much of what the artwork actually depicts does not seem especially inspired. Regardless of the map zone you're in, you will be traversing a lot of differently coloured but similarly textured blocks, and fighting small to medium-sized animals, sometimes machines or plant life, that aren't very exciting. I remember this really striking me when I reached the zone where the most common enemies are dive-bombing bugs and floating flowers. Even when the common enemies do have a distinct design, it's often something a bit bizarre like this thing that races towards you on wheels, which feels a bit out of place even on this alien world. The one exception to the rule has to be the larger creatures, particularly the bosses, which really do inspire some awe. These are examples of artistic skill and interesting design coming together. Unfortunately, you won't get to see too many of these creatures. The other thing that immediately strikes one is just how loud it is. It didn't take me long before I was turning down the volume on both the sound effects and the music by some margin. However, you don't want to turn them off completely. The sound effects were fairly stock, but the soundtrack is pretty good. It's a fast-paced chiptune soundtrack that fits the retro style of the game very well. It wasn't quite my cup of tea, in part because I heard some of the tracks too many times and they started to get a bit grating, and also because I felt too many of the tracks followed the same structure of a low, droning undertone with high-pitched notes layered on top. Of course, that's probably a personal issue with the genre as opposed to a fault with the composition. A lot of people cite the soundtrack as a standout feature of the game, and while it didn't appeal to me, I can certainly once again recognise the technical skill. So, how does it play? Well, it has an interesting control scheme, and one that's definitely better on a controller, as is recommended by the developer. Before I get into the controls, I do have to mention that I was playing the game on Epic, and found that every single time I wanted to play, I had to open up a bit of software that the manual recommends you install called SDL2 Gamepad Tool, turn my controller on, choose the Set Mapping as Environment variable option, and then restart my PC, or the game would not recognise my controller. I don't know how many other people have had the same issue, and I don't think this problem exists if you play the game on Steam, but while simple, it was annoying to have to do every time I wanted to play. Instead of using the right analog stick to aim as one might expect, you instead aim and move with the left analog stick, but can hold down the left bumper to lock yourself in place. I'm assuming that this choice was made with the game's retro style in mind, and to intentionally slow the player down, as further evidenced by the fact you can only aim in a set direction, as opposed to a 360-degree free aim. I'm not convinced it needed this limitation, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it suffered because of it. It's not a game that demands precision movement and shooting. There is one objectively poor choice when it comes to the controls, and that is mapping the dash ability to a double tap, or double flick, of the analog stick or D-pad in the direction you wish to dash into. If your game has a dash ability, it should be bound to a button. The double tap method never stops feeling clunky, and regularly gets in the way both when platforming and fighting. Oh, for fuck's sake. However, aside from these quirks, and even with the dash occasionally proving frustrating, The controls felt responsive, and I could only rarely blame them for any serious misfortune. Combat isn't that exciting. Most enemies have one trick or gimmick, and are easily beaten. The bosses might have 2 or 3 tricks, but as long as you're patient, they too rarely prove a challenge. Of course, given that the controls are not well suited to precise movement, this is probably for the best. A trade-off in favour of the game's retro aesthetic. I'm sure the developer could have leaned even harder into this and required more from the player, as was the case with older games, but no doubt all this would have achieved was a reminder that old games were often frustrating and, at times, unfair. It does try to make combat a bit more interesting, with a wide arsenal of weaponry, starting off with a standard blaster, moving on to guns with more interesting effects, like ricocheting bullets, or projectiles that roll along walls, or even just a fat laser beam. Unfortunately, despite the variety, a lot of these weapons never seem to provide much benefit over the few that are clearly the most effective, and as such, are rarely used. Items, too, almost never make you feel like you've just gained access to a new powerful ability, and instead just feel like keys to locked doors. I appreciate that, at its essence, is what collecting items or upgrades or power-ups or whatever in a Metroidvania should be. But what's missing is the visible increase in power, the lack of new options to consider. The items in Axiom Verge allow you to jump higher, dash through walls, grapple onto the roof, throw a drone even further. There's only really one item in the game that offers something other than a route past an obstacle: the address disruptor. Though this too is used to materialize or dematerialize certain blocks, allowing you to pass. However, it can also be fired at enemies, causing their properties to change. This has a wide variety of effects, including, but not limited to, removing invulnerability, slowing movement or fire rate, disrupting attack patterns, taking control, and even, as in the case of those floating flowers, transforming their bodies into health. It's an item that I probably should have tried out even more than I did, and I only didn't because once you get used to how an enemy moves and attacks, it's not always needed. Still, it provides an option. It's a tool at your disposal that you can use in more than one way. And it's a shame that more of the items don't feel like that. What I actually liked least about the gameplay might be the most important element that a Metroidvania needs to get right: exploration. Navigating the main paths through the various zones was fine, and the map is actually very good. It's simple to follow and easy to identify where you've run into an obstacle. It even allows you to set a couple of reminders per area, though these reminders only show as a 1 or a 2, and thus don't actually remind you of very much, which is why I rarely use them. What was annoying was how many of the hidden areas simply involved trial and error guesswork. I accept that this might not be a sentiment shared by all. I know some really enjoy uncovering a good secret, but too often I found myself scouring every block I could see with the drill until I found one that was breakable. Sometimes you at least know that there must be a way through, but at other times it's just guessing, and it gets boring rotating through the zones trying to find stuff that you're missing. Again, I acknowledge that you run into moments like this in most Metroidvanias, but I can't remember ever feeling quite as directionless as I did backtracking through Axiom Verge on my way to check one of the dozen half-remembered dead ends showing on my map. I felt I was done with the game after my first playthrough, but I had spotted on the main menu a randomizer mode which keeps the layout of the map but mixes up where the various weapons, items, and upgrades are. I decided to replay the game on this mode in the hope that my better understanding of it would lead to a more enjoyable but slightly different experience. And initially, it did. I got started with different weapons and got to use some that I had missed first time round. I was racing through with a momentum I hadn't felt before. And then it ran out. On the randomizer mode, you're able to see how long it has taken you to complete the bosses, though technically speaking 2 of these listed aren't boss fights. Now, to avoid spoilers, I'm going to blur everything but the times. These were mine at the end of my second playthrough. Can you see where the momentum might have been disrupted? It took me 2 hours and 45 minutes to get through the first 6 bosses, and then a further 3 hours and 20 minutes to beat the 7th. The reason for this gap is not that the 7th boss is inordinately difficult, but because on the randomizer mode, the essential items can end up hidden in some of the easiest places to miss. On the standard mode, these places may have hidden a simple health upgrade, but now instead hide an item you need to progress. I will say that as far as I'm aware, it is not possible for you to get softlock on the randomizer mode. In other words, an item that you need to enter a certain area will never be found in that area. And furthermore, should you get stuck, as I eventually did, there is a user-created tool that can analyze your seed and show you where everything is located. But, at least for me, this felt like defeating the point, which is why I resisted for so long, only giving up when I became worried that I had somehow been unlucky enough to get softlocked. Once I had used it to find the locations and pick up those necessary items, I was able to blast through the rest of the game, but by that point I was bored and fed up with how much wandering around I had had to do again. Which brings us to the story. It's a fairly simple one, so I'll give a quick rundown, but if you are concerned about spoilers, then please skip to here for final thoughts. As mentioned, Trace, having woken up on a hostile alien world, has to help repair some large machines on death's door. When he's done this, they, the Rusalki, reveal that there are many worlds separated by a dimension called Breach, and the world he is on is called Sudra. A man, Athatos, came through Breach some time ago and released a pathogen, killing all but the Rusalki. They ask him for his help in shutting down the Breach attractor, which is keeping the inhabitants of Sudra trapped, and which Athatos is protecting. Trace later begins hallucinating and ultimately remembers that the experiment he conducted back on Earth left him maimed, but he continued to work on scientific theories regarding other worlds. For this, he was criticized by the scientific community, and given the mocking nickname Athatos, without place. When Trace brings this up, the Rusalki explain that, in their desperation, they created a clone of Athatos from when he was younger. Trace understandably now trusts the Rusalki less, and agrees to help shut the Breach attractor down only on the condition that they do not kill Athatos, and give Trace a chance to speak to him. When Trace reaches Athatos, he explains that the Sudrans were guarding incredibly advanced technology that he wanted to take back to Earth, but they wouldn't let him, which is why he released the pathogen. Trace shuts the Breach attractor down, only for the Rusalki to go back on the agreement and kill Athatos anyway. They then knock Trace out, and he wakes up back on Earth as if the experiment never happened. But Trace can't push the ordeal from his mind. Sequel bait. The story takes a backseat, largely told via brief, exposition-heavy conversations before receding into the background again. There do appear to be alternate theories on the internet suggesting that the story is deeper than is seemingly depicted, but the bits I read seem to be stretching a lot out of a little. In conclusion, I feel I can sum up every aspect of Axiom Verge with the statement, it works, but it doesn't stand out. It's all functional, it's all polished, all of it bears the mark of having been created by a talented professional. But there isn't enough there that's engaging. I can see it being a good game for speedrunning. I think it's suited well for something like that. But for the average player, I could only recommend it if you've already played through some of the other acclaimed Metroidvanias available. Even then, you might just be better off replaying those. Until next time.